Hello, my name's Steve Cragg and I'm the current chair of the Bar Human Rights Committee, BHRC. On behalf of BHRC and our partners at the Human Rights Lawyers Association Young Lawyers Committee, we're delighted to be hosting this virtual seminar today, Human Rights, Careers, Skills and Values. Human rights work is an essential tool for holding governments and powerful entities accountable for their actions. Many victims of human rights abuses lack access to legal representation or the resources to seek justice. Encouraging more law students and early career lawyers to specialize in or contribute time to human rights work can help bridge this gap. As more law students and early career lawyers enter the field of human rights, they can influence the legal profession's values and priorities, fostering a future culture of law that emphasizes social justice and the protection of fundamental rights. You can make a difference. This seminar is a core part of BHRC's programme and affirms our keen commitment to inspiring and supporting the next generation of human rights defenders. We've got some fantastic sessions today and full of lawyers and NGOs at the forefront of human rights work in the UK and abroad. One of the key aims for today is for you to hear from people actually doing the work, to find out what they do and to also find out how they got to where they are today, to give you some ideas as to what a career in human rights looks like. Therefore, to pursue that, we've got panels today on what human rights lawyers and defenders actually do, how to cope with the work from a wellbeing point of view, the importance of pro bono or volunteer work, and a session on the actual skills you need to do human rights work. After this seminar concludes today, we'll be writing a report for publication that distills the discussions from today and contains valuable advice and recommendations, information and contacts for students and early career practitioners who are joining us today. I think we've got hundreds of people joining us for this seminar and really looking forward to the progress as we go through the day. So we're going to kick off with a short opening session with me and the vice chairs of BHRC and the Human Rights Lawyers Association, talking about what those organisations do and their own journeys as human rights lawyers. So I'm pleased to introduce the speakers joining us for this opening session. Aswini Weereratne KC, who's Vice Chair of BHRC, and Lui Asquith and Shoaib M Khan, who are Vice Chairs of the Human Rights Lawyers Association. Welcome to you all. I'm going to say something very briefly about each of you, just a line or so people know who you are. Lui Asquith is a solicitor at Russell Cook with a particular specialism in human rights law, government policy-related challenges and discrimination claims. Louis' website says they are tenacious, hardworking and loves their job. All those, of course, are great attributes for a human rights lawyer. Shoaib Khan is a barrister and solicitor advocate. He's a human rights specialist and principal at SMK Law Solicitors. Shoaib has worked on cases at all levels, including the European Court of Human Rights, and he's a regular media commentator on legal issues. Aswini is a KC at Doughty Street Chambers. She has established a practice advocating for vulnerable children and adults in a wide range of practice areas, embracing human rights, public and private law, inquests, inquiries, and international law. So I want to start off just talking about what BHRC and HRLA actually do. So I wanted to start off by asking Shoaib to describe briefly the work of the Human Rights Lawyers Association. Thank you, Shoaib.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Welcome everyone who's joined us. It's amazing to see so many people here. Hopefully more will be joining as the day goes past. Thank you so much to the BHRC and the Young Lawyers Committee of the HRLA for organising this. I think hopefully it should be a really useful event for law students and others starting out with a career in human rights. The Human Rights Lawyers Association is essentially a forum for everyone interested in or involved in human rights law in the UK. We have more than 1,000 members at the moment, including obviously solicitors, barristers, other practitioners, judges, academics, and more importantly, I guess, for today's session, pupils, trainees, students, and others interested in joining the field of human rights law. So we are essentially open to everyone connected with the law who has an interest in human rights working in this jurisdiction. We have now been operating for 20 years. So this year, in fact, was our 20th anniversary. We had an event to celebrate and mark that just last week. So that event as well, you can keep an eye out for that. So that was recorded. We had some amazing speakers there helping us celebrate our anniversary, including the former president of the ECHR and many other eminent lawyers. So obviously, do keep an eye out on our website for the recording and write-ups and about that event that we had. In particular, I guess, for today's session and the audience we have today, we do have a very, very active Young Lawyers Committee as well, who form a very integral part of what we do and are very active in furthering our aims. They organize student-specific events in particular. Lui will speak more about that shortly, but they organize careers days to speak where students can speak to experienced human rights lawyers. They have mooting competitions, essay competitions, and so on. We also have a bursary scheme, which again, Lui will tell you more about. So in a nutshell, that's what the HRLA does. We are open to everyone who is interested in human rights law or works in human rights law at all levels of experience or qualification. We have different levels of membership. Obviously, go to our website to have a look there. But particularly, again, for students, the membership is free. So please feel free to just join up so you can learn more about us and at least be on our mailing list to hear more about our events and initiatives. So I think that's it from me about the HRLA for now. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you. I'll hand over to Lui for
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, morning, everybody. Thanks ever so much for joining. Just to echo Shoaib's thanks in that regard, and well done to all involved for putting on a fantastic day. Those who are viewing the sessions throughout the day, embrace it. Make sure you reach out to people if you can. I'm going to be talking about the opportunities that the HRLA offers. And opportunities are crucial. Getting a foot in the door, you know, in this field is not always easy. And you know, I am someone that I grew up in the north of England, comprehensive background, etc., etc. And I relate to the feeling of, well, how the hell do I get my foot in the door? And it's all down to opportunity. So use today. HRLA, as Shoaib has said, is a free opportunity to meet people, to find those opportunities that you may need. So a few of the opportunities that we offer, the annual bursary fund, so that enables those without financial backing to take up internships. So internships are often sort of bandied around as what one should do, but it's not always easy to fund and next to impossible for a lot of people. So the bursary fund is there to try and fill that gap. The mooting competition, so upskilling yourself in with your debating skills is an excellent thing to do. So a mooting competition is something that we put on. I think it's the final this evening, Shoaib, is that right? Yeah. Semi-final, semi-final tonight. The Lord Kerr essay competition is an annual competition, which again allows you to really start to expand your skill set in drafting, in persuasive arguments. This year's essay was entitled, "Is there a human right to live free from poverty, and should there be?" And the winner, just to give them another shout out, was Alexis Body. So well done, Alexis. And Alexis's essay is on the Supreme Court blog, so a really great way to canvass and platform yourself there. The Careers Day, as Shoaib mentioned, is an annual event put on by the Young Lawyers Committee, and allows you to network and engage. Networking is one of the most crucial skill sets that I think students, young lawyers can establish. And then getting involved on committees themselves. We have the election coming up early next year, and if you're interested in getting involved in the HRLA from a committee perspective, then you can. So have a look, see if you're interested, sign up and get involved. And just to say, we don't have a member of the Young Lawyers Committee on this panel currently, but just want to offer my thanks to the Young Lawyers Committee, who put in a huge amount of effort in making today work and run smoothly. So thank you to our colleagues. And I'll leave it there, Steve.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to hand over now to Aswini to tell him to do something about the wonderful organisation, which is our Human Rights Committee. Thank you, Aswini.
Oh, thanks, Steve. And firstly, to say about the HRLA that as a previous chair, I can endorse everything that's been said, and the dedication and commitment of the Young Lawyers Committee and the committee in that organisation does a fantastic job. And I'm so happy to see that it's celebrating its anniversary shortly as well, 20th anniversary. So well done, all of you. So I'm actually here to speak about the Bar Human Rights Committee. And as it says on our website, BHRC is dedicated to promoting principles of justice and respect for fundamental human rights through upholding the rule of law and supporting human rights defenders globally. So not in the UK, but globally. So that's a bit of a mouthful. To me, it's simple. It's about the need to understand and fight for the rule of law, particularly now, it seems to be more urgent than ever. And what happens elsewhere happens at home as well, eventually, I would say. And so it's important for us to have an eye to global events and global structures as well. So law obviously is the framework by which the rights of ordinary citizens are protected, as well as their ability to hold governments and institutions to account. Yet as we look around the world, we see that governments and institutions from the very top are being squeezed and their validity called into account. So, you know, that it forms, I would say, a backdrop or context to what BHRC gets involved in. What we do, we raise awareness, protecting the rights, as I've said, of human rights advocates, judges, activists, through public statements highlighting legal concerns and drawing attention to alleged violations where we become aware of them and where we can make a difference, we hope. We're also able to intervene in cases around the world and are able to harness our expertise in international human rights law. And the committee and the membership is broad, and we are fortunate that we have a number of experts on the panel that we can draw on. So you will see from our website that in September, for example, BHRC submitted an amicus brief on the exclusion of evidence obtained by torture in relation to the case of Mr. al-Nashiri before the military commission at Guantanamo Bay. A member of the EC, and in fact, I see she's just logged in, Jodie Blackstock, was able to travel to Guantanamo to observe part of those proceedings and produce a very insightful report, which was launched by BHRC a few months ago. Last year, we partnered with the American Bar Association Rule of Law Initiative to produce a report expounding a regional approach to confronting key legal challenges. And this followed 6 months of virtual dialogue with practitioners, academics, civil society actors, and policymakers openly discussing some of the most acute challenges in the rule of law, to the rule of law in Asia. So looking at Hong Kong, China, and other Central and Southeast Asian countries. More recently, we are very proud to say that BHRC was voted into the UN Economic and Social Council in July. This is no mean feat and recognizes BHRC's 30-year commitment to upholding human rights and the rule of law globally. And this obviously gives BHRC a seat at the table to participate fully and formally in UN meetings. Other things that we've done, we've worked, as I say, we respond to events as they happen. Recently, we spotlighted the rule of law in South Asia in a series called Diminishing Democracy, focusing on Myanmar, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. Again, in a series of events with lawyers and activists from each of those countries, and we'll be hopefully producing a report on that series in the next few months. In the past, we've produced a toolkit on lawyers at risk. This was published in 2020 in collaboration with a number of long-term partners, and that's something I should highlight. We are able and fortunate to partner with a number of other NGOs who are very active in this field. And I mentioned that because we do have, and I'm chairing a session later today on resilience and well-being, which I think is a very important feature, not just of the practice of law generally, but particularly in this area. So I hope that's enough of a little bit of a background to what BHRC does, Steve.
Thank you very much, Aswini. That's fantastic. I've just been looking at the chat while she's been speaking. I can see we've got people logging in from all around the world. So welcome to you all to this session. I'm just going to move on now, the few minutes we've got left in this opening session, just to ask each of you what your human rights work has meant to you personally, and just to give us one example of a human rights case that has that you've worked on, which has resonated for you in your work. So I can start with Lui, first of all.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'm going to answer the question, but in perhaps a different way than one may expect. And that what I wanted to say was, when we're talking about human rights practice, I think it's easy to pull towards sort of one ideal of what that means. And what I wanted to say to those listening is that a human rights practice arrives in every corner of the law. And wherever you end up, wherever you start, if you want to be a human rights lawyer, look at where you start and find the human rights elements to it. When I started out in practice, I qualified to a legal aid firm and did predominantly care proceedings work. And when we talk about what resonates, I think I want to focus on that more generally. The care proceeding work that I worked on, the frontline stuff that you deal with in those kind of facets of law, I think are some of the most crucial areas of human rights law that one can engage with. So the glitzy stuff, the Stasi stuff I could talk about, but actually I want to focus on that. And the care proceedings work that I dealt in when I first qualified, was some of the most hard-hitting work that I think I'll ever deal with. But the message I want to get across is, the whole point of human rights law is that it encapsulates and straddles everything. So look at what you're thinking about, look at what you're working on, and become a human rights lawyer by making sure you're thinking about it, whatever you're doing. So, as I say, it's not a direct answer, but I hope it offers a perspective.
Thanks, Lui. No, that reminds me very well of a construction lawyer I met the other day who said, "Oh well, there's no human rights law in what I do." I thought, well, hold on, wait a minute. What about health and safety, or the workers' rights? What about human rights and business and all those kind of facts? So I think that's exactly right. You need to find, there's always a human rights element to the kind of work you're doing, and it's important to find out what that is. All right, I'm going to come to Aswini now and just ask you those same questions.
Caught me by surprise.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No. I just think that Louis' answer was brilliant and absolutely the right thing to say, because looking into every corner of things that you work on or care about impacts on individuals and their rights and human rights. So that's just absolutely right. And in fact, I've been thinking much along the same lines myself, Louis, because as Steve said, focus on vulnerable adults, and that basically started with my interest in mental health and mental health law. And that's one area of certainly domestic law and practice which has been intimately affected or protected by human rights, because of the ability now for particularly people who are detained in hospital to challenge their detention through strict criteria that are applied, through the speediness of tribunals that are required, and the whole process that encapsulates that experience, which is obviously a terrifying experience for individuals, is now very carefully controlled by processes that have been developed through human rights law, particularly Article 5 of the European Convention. And that has come about not just through domestic law, but through cases that are then taken to the European Court of Human Rights, particularly have influenced the changes in domestic legislation that have followed from that. And then, so I've been able to participate at those levels, but I've also recently, or perhaps not so recently, been able to advise NGOs on similar structures and in terms of mental health detentions in other continents. So done a case relating to a man in Kenya who died in a mental institution there. So, those skills translate. They start off with the things you're connected here, but you'll see the ways in which you can use them elsewhere, when you look. But if I have to think about one case which touched me, I always come to this case. It's the case of Stephen Neary, and I reaching for it because I did that case a long time ago, and it was in the Court of Protection, and the judge made some strident findings under Article 5 that Stephen had been kept away from his father unlawfully, and Stephen was a young man with severe autism, learning disability, in need of care in the right environment, but had been taken into an environment which was increasingly detention, and that was the intention of the public authority. Well, we got him home and back to his father, and you might have thought job done, or perhaps, I never think that really, but when I met Stephen's dad recently, he told me that Stephen has a photograph of me and others who were involved in supporting him and keeping him out of detention, if you like, in his home. And I can't tell you, I was so touched, because that drew me into the impact that particular case had on that individual and his family, something I hadn't really anticipated. So you don't get many of those moments, to be quite honest, but it was what I thought I might share with you. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Aswini. Thanks so much for that. Shoaib, just going on to you now to hear what your personal thoughts and experiences are. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Stephen. Yes, basically to echo, firstly, what Lui and Aswini both said. Obviously, human rights law and human rights cases aren't necessarily found in what we might think of in terms of more pure human rights cases, but every aspect. Just really quickly, I know it was, even sort of who people we think of as human rights legends. So I think it was probably a decade or so ago, Baroness Helena Kennedy, of course. She herself, she said, I'm quite surprised when people speak of me as a human rights lawyer. I'm just a criminal lawyer. That's what I do. And, it's just, yes, at the back of my mind, of course, I have the interests and the human rights and the rights of the defendant and the victim, and so on. And so, yes, I'm just aware of those and open to those things. But obviously, a criminal lawyer is what I do essentially. One hopes that maybe in the decade or so since then, she's become a bit more used to being called a human rights lawyer now. But yes, of course, I think that is the essence of the work that we do. In terms of my own career, very quickly, so one thing that I want to speak about is immigration detention. So that is obviously people who are held by the Home Office, detained under immigration powers. Some of them might have committed a criminal offense. Many of them have no criminal history at all. We are the only country in Europe that has indefinite immigration detention, which basically means there is no time limit on how long the Home Office can hold someone for. And just two cases related to that I did. So one of them is probably around a decade ago, and that is, I think it was around 2012, 2013. And that was, I think, regarded as the longest period of immigration detention at the time. So this person had been held in immigration detention for around more than 6 years in aggregate. And obviously we secured him bail, then the case went to the High Court and so on. It did become quite a protracted case. I, in fact, had reason to read the High Court judgment yesterday, and for something else I was doing, just looking at that. And unfortunately, that tragic record has in fact been broken now. And I saw another lawyer talking about someone online who has been detained for 8 years now under immigration powers. So obviously that is still continuing. And I think it's absolutely tragic that that is the situation, in a society purportedly, based on the rule of law and human rights and human dignity, to still be seeing this. Another related case that I did, and I'm sure, many legal colleagues, immigration lawyers were a part of, was when detainees in various immigration detention centers were part of a coordinated hunger strike, maybe I think around 3 or 4 years ago. And again, it was absolutely tragic, really harrowing, really, to be speaking and seeing those, going in and seeing those people, those desperate people, the situation they were in, and trying to help them. And obviously made worse by the Home Office's or the authorities' attitude at the time. One thing that sticks to mind is a statement they put out generally just saying that, anyone on, obviously blaming them for being on hunger strike, but generally saying that anyone on hunger strike, the cases would be expedited. So essentially one might think, okay, that means they're actually looking into these people. But basically what that meant was, if you're on hunger strike, you would be the first to be deported, really. And so obviously, that is something that has, stayed with me, those cases. And obviously immigration detention, immigration detainees, those are people we, immigration asylum lawyers, we deal with day in, day out. But I think that is an ongoing thing that we all need to be aware of. And there does need to be sort of a more coordinated campaign against this, this quite inhumane system, really. Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks, Shoaib, so much for that. Thank you so much, all of you, for sharing your experiences. I did ask you all to be snappy at the start of the session. You have been, which actually means that I've got a couple of minutes left before we hand over to the next session. And that gives me the chance to say one thing I wanted to say about human rights work, and also perhaps my experience as well, which is this. We're going to have a lot of the great, the good on the sessions today, who've forged human rights careers, but a lot of people start their human rights work locally, and I think that's also a good place to look. I started my career at a local law centre in London, and that was helping local people with immigration problems, asylum problems, with problems with the police, problems with housing, and those kind of problems. And you suddenly realise that you are essentially being a human rights lawyer for the local community. And I think that's a fantastic way to start. If you're wondering, well, how can I get involved? You don't just need to look for master's degrees or internships. Find out what's going in your local area, advice shops, law centres and the like, and that can be a very good way to start and meet people who are involved and interested in doing human rights law. So that's my takeaway from this session. I did want to thank our three speakers. Thank you all very much for sharing your personal thoughts and cases to get us kicked off for today. I'm now, that's the end of our opening session. I'm now pleased to hand over to the next session. I just did also want to mention that the session today is being recorded, and so it will be available if you enjoyed it and got something from it to listen to it again or pass it on to friends. But now I just want to pass over to Jodie Blackstock, who's the chair of session 2. Session 2 is what do human rights careers involve, and we'll get some more day-to-day experience of what human rights work looks like. And Jodie is the treasurer of the Bar Human Rights Committee. She's a barrister at Gardenport Chambers and the former legal director of the organisation Justice. So over to you and our speakers for session 2. Thank you, Jodie.
Thanks, Steve. Good morning, everyone. That was really interesting to hear the introductions about our two partner organisations, and it's great to be partnering this event with Human Rights Lawyers Association. So yes, this session then is called "What Do Human Rights Careers Involve? A Day in the Life of," and we're delighted to have three fantastic speakers, one who is just dealing with the technology and in the process of joining us, but I'll do the introductions nevertheless. And I'm glad to say also that Ruth has followed my lead and gone for colour rather than the black suits of the usual traditional clothing that we all have to wear, and Adam is very much rocking the about to put his wig on attire of the morning, so he can perhaps tell us tell us what he's about to do when he's finished this session with us. So we're really in this session looking at what does a day in the life of a human rights lawyer look at. I'm very conscious of the thoughts in the last session that really every area of law should be human rights, and it's how you ensure that we all apply human rights law within our practice. But nevertheless, there are some of us who are more focused on traditional ideas of human rights litigation than others, I suppose, and that's the benefit we'll have from this session of speaking to these three individuals. So I'm delighted to introduce you to Adam Rodner, who is a barrister at Doughty Street Chambers, and that really doesn't cover everything that he's been up to since he started practice in 2007. He's been involved in many of the leading cases around freedom and right to protest, a lot of work on the COVID pandemic and challenges around how that impacts on individual freedoms. He set up the One Crown Office Row Human Rights blog when we were both within that set, which is brilliant, and expanded that out to the education charity Each Other, which tries to educate people on human rights and what they mean in layperson's language, and many other things, which I'm hopeful he will talk to us about. Yasmin Ahmed joins us as well, who is now the UK Director of Human Rights Watch, and comes from a long line of NGO practice. From her start as a lawyer in Australia, she moved into the international sphere, so we'll be able to tell us lots about that before joining the organisation Rights and Security International, which is very much focused on issues around terrorism and the consequences of that, which would be really interesting to hear about. And then finally, we are also delighted to have Ruth Mercer with us, who is a solicitor at Southwark Law Centre, which she joined through the fantastic Justice First Fellowship, and will be able to tell us about her project in terms of achieving settled status whilst working there, and what she's now up to after these years have passed. I think it was 2019, wasn't it, when you first started there on the Justice First Fellow Trainee Scheme. So thank you all. We have a few questions, pre-prepared questions, which we're going to go through because we think that's a good way of ensuring we capture all of your great experiences, and we'll spend just over half an hour on that, and then we'll be able to take questions from the audience, of which we have over 137 people. Well, we have 137 people. I was going to say over 130, and then I realised actually there's 7 more than that. Questions, please put them in the Q&A so that we can find them there, and be thinking about your questions as we go along, please. So then, the first question we have for you is, could you describe a typical day in your role within the human rights law field, and what are some of the key tasks and challenges you face regularly? Adam, do you want to kick us off?
Thanks, Jodie, and thanks everyone for coming. And I'm not just trying to put on a show by wearing my court dress, and I'm going in straight after this to a hearing. If you're interested in what it is, it's a judicial review by the Law Society into the decision by the government to not fully implement the findings of the review into legal aid that was done by Lord Bellamy a couple of years ago, and I'm acting for the interested parties, which are two criminal law associations, which is why I'm not going in straight away. Typical day. I hate this question because I don't hate the question, but it's a difficult question because I don't really have a typical day. As Jodie sort of said, I do a lot of different things, and I don't really even have a typical month, let alone a typical day. But generally speaking, I'll go into chambers, which is down the street, a couple of days a week, maybe 3 days a week. I'm sometimes in court. Sometimes I'll be in court quite a bit over a period, and sometimes I won't be in court a lot at all over a number of weeks. And I'll be doing a lot of work in chambers or at home. So I work at home probably a couple of days a week on average. And I do sort of, my practice is mainly in public law, human rights, public inquiries, and some inquest work. And pretty much all on the claimant side, so acting against public authorities. And on top of that, I do a lot of media work, as in actually media interviews and trying to sort of campaign over particular issues, and also trying to explain the law to the public, which is something I've always done alongside what my sort of practice. And I have a charity. I set up a charity which I chair called Each Other, which it comes in and out of the amount of time it takes, and I'm still very involved in the analysis of what happened during COVID inquiries. I'm acting during the COVID pandemic. I'm acting in the COVID inquiry, and I'm a commissioner on the Bingham Centre Emergency Powers Commission, which is going to report in January. So that's an interesting sort of dual role, and I'll leave it there.
Fantastic, thank you. Yeah, juggling lots and lots of different things by the sound of it. And I guess the thing a lot with this job is you pick something up and you do some focus work on it, and then you do something on another thing, and then you come back to it. And it's juggling, isn't it? That is quite a lot of the task for your brain to move from one thing to another quite quickly. Yasmin, can I come to you next, please?
Sure. And thank you, Jodie. What an honour it is to be speaking with you, given all your amazing human rights work that you've done in civil society and as a barrister, and also with Adam and Ruth, both of whom I deeply admire. So thank you for having me on the panel, and thanks to all those that are joining. So I think it's similar to what Adam said. It's really hard to talk about a typical day, but what I will do is talk to you a little bit about what my role is, and then a little bit of some of the things that I do in my role. So I'm the UK director of Human Rights Watch, as Jodie mentioned. And what that means essentially is I'm the sort of key Human Rights Watch representative in the UK. I lead on our advocacy, our communications, so like all our work in the media. And I also, and in terms of what does that actually mean? Like what kind of work? So I am responsible both for the foreign policy portfolio, as well as the domestic work that we do in the UK, which I work with our colleagues in the Europe and Central Asia division on. So what does it mean, foreign policy? So my job in terms of foreign policy is to take the work that we do at Human Rights Watch, whether it's on Egypt, Israel, Palestine, on a range on Myanmar, and really get that research work, and then think strategically about how I can push the UK government to take on the recommendations that we have for them. And that may be a series of different recommendations. It may be recommendations about imposing sanctions, about allowing relocation of individuals from situations where they're at real risk. It may be exercising universal jurisdiction. It may be just calling out criminal activity or violations of human rights. So there's a whole range of things that we as a human rights organisation are pushing the UK government to do on a range of different countries and or thematic issues. It may be on issues around externalization of refugees. It may be on pushing for better, universal social protection in certain countries, so on and so forth. So that's the foreign policy side. On the domestic side, as I said, I work with my colleagues in the Europe and Central Asia division on domestic human rights issues, and things that have been on my plate over the last year have been around the Rwanda deal. So we work and we do research, and so we've done an extensive body at Human Rights Watch of research for decades now on the human rights situation in Rwanda. So we will elevate those issues in the context of issues that are happening domestically. And obviously we know the UK government's Rwanda deal. We will coordinate with MPs, with legal people who are taking legal cases, so on and so forth, to ensure that the work that we're doing in our research is elevated in the context of that, and to push back against, obviously, what the UK government had proposed and is continuing to propose in relation to the deal with Rwanda. We've also worked on a range of other domestic and continue to work on a range of other domestic issues. So for me, really, my day might be, what does that look like in a day? It might be, I'm on a meeting interview in the morning about what's happening in Israel-Palestine. I'm then meeting with a minister around, say, for example, on Friday or Thursday, I met with the shadow minister for the Middle East and North Africa, Wayne David. I might then be meeting with another minister that's currently in government on, say, Sudan. I then am thinking about and developing a strategy around the anti-boycott bill, which is being introduced in Parliament, which might require us to produce detailed submissions and do parliamentary advocacy. So really, there's a whole range of things that I'm doing, both from sort of front-end advocacy and media to more kind of long-term strategy and more detailed work.
Thank you. That's a really clear summary of what it is to be an NGO lawyer. Thank you so much. And I think what it kind of illustrates, and I'm sure Ruth will be able to show this even more in a moment, is the distinction between, litigating, which is what those of us in the self-employed bar in particular now, and solicitors like Ruth are doing most of the time, and then being an NGO lawyer where you're using all of those legal skills that you've learned, but actually what you're trying to do is influence government decision-making, local authority decision-making, procedural change for a vast amount of people, rather than focusing in on one individual case. So it's looking for the strategic possibilities, I guess, isn't it? And I think the example you give there with Rwanda is a really important one, because all of that research that you've been able to bring to bear, the Supreme Court has, identified in its judgment the core reasons why the situation in Rwanda is not appropriate for us to send people to will be very much influenced by that kind of research on the ground. So it's critical to do the research, but then to be able to apply it in a way that makes meaningful change. So thank you so much for all your work. Can I come to Ruth then next, please, with the same question? Tell us what your day-to-day work life looks like, if we may.
Yeah, so I like Adam and Jasmine, every day is completely different, which is something that I really love about my job. It's never ever boring being a solicitor in this field. So as a solicitor, my job, I'm mostly an immigration solicitor. I also do some migrant accommodation and some homelessness work too. But as a solicitor, my job involves lots and lots of client interaction. I spend a lot of my time meeting my clients, on the phone to my clients, going to see them where they are, and talking to them about what's happened and asking them about some of the most difficult experiences they've ever had, and helping them break it down and work out what their rights are and how we can go about getting them access to those rights. Another thing, I work for a law centre in South London, in Peckham, which means I work for a really supportive charity, and my days are very flexible. They're very supportive to me, putting my time around family commitments, which is a really nice work-life balance that I've got. So I'll often, I'm quite productive first thing, so I'll often start off with, if I need to draft some legal representations or a statement, I'll get that done first, and then my clients start contacting me probably from somewhere in the mid-morning, and then they just contact me for most of the day about various points. So for example, last week I met a new asylum and trafficking client, so I spent most of the morning talking to her about what she had experienced. She'd just escaped from a trafficking experience and was referred to me by a local hospital after she jumped out of the window. So that was her first time really telling somebody all those things that had happened. So it's a really emotionally difficult job. That's a big part of what I do, is managing to talk to people about those things and to help them explain what's happened. And then to give her advice, okay, we're going to claim asylum. So she's down at Luna House this morning in Croydon getting in an asylum application, and we're going to take it from there. I also have a lot of meetings in the day. I talk to colleagues a lot. I talk to people outside of my law centre too. So often the clients will come to me and they've got, immigration issue is the main problem, but they've also got a health issue, and they've also got a housing issue. They've got many, many issues. So I need to get them all the different bits of support they need, counselling. There's lots of things going on. So you build up quite a big network. And then almost every day, something unexpected happens and blows up my schedule. So someone might get arrested or hospitalised, or you might get really good news as well. But it's not a typical 9 to 5, I suppose.
Yeah, thank you. And I think what you illustrate, I suppose, which is more so for the solicitor than barristers or those of us who come from the NGO field, is the importance of that relationship with the client, and that you really are the front line and you're there for them, at the end of the phone or in the office, probably not so much walk-ins now, but managing those issues immediately. And that involves a whole set of skills and resilience that you have to build up to deal with that. And of course, we deal with it in court, but we don't have the day-to-day as barristers. We've got a question about, how we manage these things at the end, and I'll come to that then. But I'm qualified in the Caribbean as well, and it's a dual profession. So I don't so much now, but when I first started, I was very much having that, walk through the door, just, come from 3 days being locked in a police station, being beaten, and I'm not sure why, kind of questions, which is, it's a very different dynamic, how you immediately go about uncovering what the legal problem is, I think. So thank you very much for all of those different experiences, everyone. Right, let's move on to question 2. And I'm conscious of the time. It was very interesting to hear all of those introductions. And I think that probably is the most detailed question, but we've still got quite a bit to get through. So we'll have to be a bit shorter on our answers on these ones. Something of what you said there, Ruth, at the end in terms of how you go about resolving the issues that come about is really segues neatly into the next question, because this is collaboration. And the importance of working with other lawyers, civil society organisations and experts in your fields. And I think you would expand this out actually to decision makers really, or local authority, whoever is able to provide the assistance that your client needs. Do you want to just expand a bit on that for us?
Yeah, I think it's really important who you need to know who you're talking to and collaborate as much as you can. And that could be internal collaboration with, we've got various departments at Southwark Law Centre. So quite often I'll be working with other solicitors who are managing an employment issue, a housing issue, other sorts of issues for clients. And then external too, we work a lot with other firms of solicitors, lots with experts. Well, lots of my clients are quite mentally unwell, so we need expert reports to get involved. And then there's the other side. It's less easy to collaborate with the Home Office, I won't lie. They're very difficult to contact, to get responses from, to get things moving along. But you do sometimes, find someone sensible who can get things moving. Local authorities are very key. We do try and have quite a good relationship with our local authority when we can, meet them quite often. And yeah, that's really useful to us to have someone that you can, at the other end of a phone call, who can pick things up and get things sorted out when they need to be.
Yes, absolutely. Yasmin, you'll come at this from a different angle, I'm sure. And it's about, I suppose, maybe those relationships on the ground, like you're talking about the research in different countries, and and who really is useful to enable those goals that you were talking about to be achieved. Can you just give us an idea of who you're looking to partner with?
Yeah, and just quickly, I guess, in a way, thinking about the question from my perspective, I'm always thinking about who are the key stakeholders strategically to bring about change. And in any given situation, those stakeholders might be different or might be the same. So for example, in the context of Rwanda work or the work we did on Northeast Syria, women and children who are in detention camps in Northeast Syria, their legal challenge was critical. So engaging with lawyers was really critical. It won't always be the case that legal challenge will be the best way to move something or the way that it is already being moved. But as you said, other civil society groups are always critical for us to work with, because we are never one organisation. There is a plethora of organisations who are also approaching things from very different angles. So really, in everything we do in the UK on foreign policy and domestic, it's always in collaboration with other civil society organisations. And I think very strategically about who they may be, because on certain issues, they will be very grassroots organisations, because it's necessary to have the victim's voice at the very front. Work we're doing on the Chagos Islands, the Chagossians are very, very central, and we're propelling them forward. We stand very much back. On other issues, working on the anti-boycott pill in Israel-Palestine is very strategic for me to think about. Yes, obviously we work with groups that are working on the rights of Palestinians, but it's been very, very important to, within that context, to also really work very closely with Jewish groups who are doing the same thing, because in our current political environment, strategically, their voice is so critical. So we've done a lot of work with them. And again, with experts, often we're thinking about how do I utilize and work with experts to propel what we're doing. We'll work with special rapporteurs, we'll work with others to elevate the issue. So really, for our perspective, it's really thinking strategically about how do we fit within an ecosystem, and also how do we bring about change and do that effectively.
Yeah, so interesting. Thank you. And Adam, I mean, you've spent some time as an advisor to Parliament's work around COVID, haven't you? And I don't know whether that gives you a different perspective on this, or something to echo from what we've heard from Ruth and Yasmin about it.
Yeah, I was advisor to the Joint Committee on Human Rights inquiry into the the human rights implications of the government response to the COVID pandemic for a year, and it was right in the middle of the pandemic. So it was a really interesting experience. I have worked for a parliamentary committee before, but I've done lots of public inquiries. Starting with a couple of ones about the war crimes in the Iraq War, and ranging from a hospital that went disastrously wrong, to the child abuse inquiry, to lots of those sort of big issues. But they all take place in retrospect. You investigate something that's already happened, whereas working with the Joint Committee, we were producing reports sort of almost live. About things that were happening that week and that last few weeks. And it had a real sort of political edge to it as well. We were trying to influence the government decision-making as it was happening, saying, for example, on the right to protest, the protest rights are being really seriously impacted by the bans on gatherings. And increasingly in the last few years, I've been working in lots of areas where there's a real sort of mixture of different kinds of campaigning, ranging from political influencing to public influencing to using litigation. I'm working increasingly on issues rather than particular cases necessarily. So, for example, with COVID, I was working with the Joint Committee on Human Rights on these. We were producing reports on things like hotel quarantine, on the right to protest, on the big £10,000 fines that would be given for lots of students. But at the same time, I was working on cases that dealt with the same issues. The most successful of which was the Reclaim These Streets case, the Sarah Everard vigil, which was kind of, it's a piece of work that had many elements to it. We were working, at the beginning, I was contacted by the Reclaim These Streets organisation, and I put together a team of solicitors and barristers, and we were working directly with the police and meeting directly with the police, with the Metropolitan Police, to try and resolve the issues before they became issues around the vigil. And then that became, that was always with an eye to potentially using litigation if we couldn't get what we needed, which we did. We sort of tried to get an interim judgment on the night before the vigil, which sort of only semi-succeeded. And then eventually it became a piece of retrospective litigation, which did succeed. But it was a whole, it was a whole piece of strategic work that didn't start with, we're going to sue you. It started with, can we work with you to sort this out? And I mean, that fits with, so I'm doing work at the moment with families, British families of people who are being held hostage by Hamas. And that is a work that involves political influencing, public influencing, and possibly legal work as well. But it's a mixture, and that's the modern sort of campaigning lawyer, the lefty lawyer, as the government might describe. That's a real big feature of what a lot of us do. Is you have to have, it's not, the answer isn't always litigation. The answer can be lots of things. But I just want to say one more thing, which just to bring it back down to the a really simple level, which is that to the people listening, many of whom will be students. I'd really want to encourage you to think about the people you are engaging with now as your future colleagues, and potentially your future opponents, potentially the future people that you need to be in your network to influence and to help you with the issues you get involved in. And that was something which I've always been really wary of from the very beginning, from when I was doing my law conversion, that these are the people that I might be working with in the future. And it turned out to be absolutely true. Jodie and I have known each other for probably 15 years, I guess, since we were both very junior at the same chambers. And if you, and put it in the negative sense, if you poison relationships in those early days, they will be remembered. It will come back to you. And the flip side is that if you treat people well, and with empathy and with understanding, not everything has to be you're against me and I'm against you, and therefore we hate each other. But if you treat people properly, then that will always come back round, and it will always help you sometime in the future. So that is it's such an important part of what we do, on the black letter law side, just being a litigator, but also on the more campaigning side. So keep those relationships close, build your networks, and you never know where they're going to come in useful in the future.
Thank you, Adam. That's really helpful advice, and I'd agree. And it can be hard when you feel like you're on opposite sides, and there's certain people who are always doing government representation, and certain people are always doing claimant representation, for want of a better word, in this space. And yeah, we're all just doing our job, I guess, and it doesn't mean that you necessarily align with. Well, you probably don't align with, if you're alleging human rights abuses, you won't be aligning with them. So you're right. Those relationships are important, and they will come back to assist you in due course as you go along. And I mean, we're not here to talk about courtcraft by any stretch, but certainly very good advice that I was given that I continue to try to follow is the most important person in the room is the usher. You get the best experience if you're kind and courteous to everyone, and that all gets back to the judge. And we're dealing with very, very difficult issues. The last thing you need to do is have difficult relationships with everybody else in the room as well. So yeah, really important. Okay, so our third question is around the media and civil society organisations playing a role. So this isn't about how do you craft your cause or campaign or whatever, briefing, litigation. It's more about how do you get your message out to the audience you're trying to approach. And Adam, you've been fantastic at this over the years, so I don't know if you want to kick off on this one, but can you share strategies and anecdotes about your interaction with media and civil society in your work, and how do you engage with these stakeholders to amplify your advocacy efforts?
Yeah, I mean, I've always been happy to do media, do interviews, that sort of thing, and I've always quite enjoyed it. I mean, obviously I got extremely nervous. I used to get very, very nervous before doing things, and then it became really quite, second nature in a way, particularly during the COVID pandemic, where I sort of not deliberately, but just seemed to get to this point where I was being asked to explain the COVID laws and they were coming out every 3 days. And I would sometimes do, I'm sat in my room in my very small study at home, as everyone else was. And I would sometimes do sort of 5 interviews just back to back or just through the day, sitting in this one room. And then I'd be, on Zoom calls with work. And it was really an extraordinary time. My children found it hilarious. To the amount that I was doing and that that people would see, but I've always it comes from 2 places really. It's not because I love seeing myself on TV. I generally don't like seeing myself on TV. It's because I've always been extremely enthusiastic to explain the human rights law to the public. It's just been a big part of my reason for doing what I'm doing. I feel like if only lawyers have access to human rights, then they're not really human rights at all. That it's just a closed shop, and it's unfortunate that a lot of human rights is in law and is in quite complicated areas. But I don't think it has to be like that, and that's why I've tried over the years to. I mean, I was on Twitter, really early, and I remember when I started in my chambers, my first chambers, One Crown Office Row. And I set up this blog, the Human Rights blog. It was, I think the only reason they let me do it is because nobody really knew what it was. And I didn't realize it would become very popular and very sort of well read. And Twitter was the same. It was kind of, everybody's on Twitter now and on social media, but lawyers really weren't when I started doing it. And I felt really exposed and concerned that one day, somebody who actually knew what they were talking about was going to come onto Twitter. I just had the arena because no one else was there, and certainly no human rights experts were there. Not that I was a human rights expert then, but I was, had this constant fear that somebody would come on and expose me as not knowing what I'm talking about. But I think what that meant was I was always really careful about what I said. I've always had sort of a few basic rules. First one being assume that anything you say, and this accounts for all media, is going to be seen by a judge and your mother. And now I think of my children as well. Do I want my children to see me behaving in a, being aggressive to people or being rude? I try and model the behavior, even if it means not responding when people, as they do on social media, become very upset and angry. There's always someone who's angry about anything. You can literally say anything about anything. There's always someone who's angry. The other basic bit of advice about writing, particularly, is always use primary sources and always link to them. And that, whether it's the law or whether it's a particular statute or a case, never rely on someone else's description of something, and always be able to, and then you can always back it up. And also people can check what you're saying. And the third thing I always do is correct myself if I get something wrong, and don't be proud about, because everybody makes mistakes. Nobody's perfect. And if you are not open to criticism, then you will make more and more mistakes. You'll never learn. And also you kind of embarrass yourself. So those are my sort of basic rules, and I've always applied them. And I try to stick to explaining the law as I see it, and not take a very sort of hard view on things. But then that does sometimes drift into or become a bit more campaigning work. And I'm very happy to use the influence I've got to campaign on particular issues or a case I'm involved in, if I've got permission from my client or my client wants me to do that. So it's a mixture. I wouldn't recommend it as a sort of, I don't think it's necessary to have a career in law at all to do that. I think, and it's also not everybody's cup of tea, and that's fine. But I really enjoy it, and I feel like I've got a lot out of it as well.
Thank you very much, Adam. I'm going to move on to the next question now, because I'm conscious of the time and there's lots of questions coming in, so I want to give us time to answer some of your burning questions as well. And I think this one is probably going to be directed at Yasmin rather than anyone else, really, because of your experience. Although others do, Ruth and Adam, do shout out if you've got something to add here. But this one is about international and regional human rights structures. which can obviously be crucial to advancing human rights. And do you have experience of navigating the complex landscape of working with the UN system to advance human rights causes? Can you share specific examples of your interactions with UN agencies and mechanisms or regional courts and systems such as Council for Europe, European Union? I mean, obviously, taking cases to Strasbourg is the apex court for this jurisdiction, so some of us will have experience of going to Strasbourg. But I think what's quite interesting and less accessible, if indeed Strasbourg is ever accessible, for the students listening today, is to understand how the UN system works. And obviously you've got experience from the ICC as well, Yasmin. So could you just give us a sort of flavour of that in answering this question, if you could?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. So, as you kind of quite rightly noted out, there's a number of multilateral fora, either kind of the international multilateral fora of the UN, and then you also have the regional multilateral fora with the, the European Court of Human Rights, the Council of Europe, and then you obviously have the African Commission, and you have it in other jurisdictions as well. So I have experience, yes, I have experience in engaging with both the sort of international multilateral fora and in the regional multilateral fora, in particular the European Court of Human Rights and the Council of Europe. So I think in terms of what does my experience of the international fora look like? So I think it can be deeply frustrating in some regards. And I think that's partly, as a human rights advocate, is you need to accept to some degree the limitations, but then also identify the opportunities of how you can work within these. And so I think sometimes we come into this and we think everything's going to be solved if only we can get the UN to engage. The UN is a deeply politicized and a difficult bureaucracy to move. But when you can move it and it can engage, it is powerful, but you have to be realistic about that. So what does that look like? Sometimes, and it's going to be always very difficult to move the Security Council on anything because of veto and because of it's highly politicized. But if you do get movement there, obviously they have powers like nobody else has powers. So it's really important. But there's been very few examples that I've worked on where we've tried in relation to Sudan, Ethiopia, Israel, Palestine, and we've always come up against vetoes. But I would say then the General Assembly still remains a really critical component. We've seen in the current Israel-Palestine context, the Security Council was vetoed by the US, and there was abstaining by the UK and others in relation to sort of things around Israel-Palestine, the current context. But then we saw the General Assembly, which is obviously represents all states, really moving and taking a role. They don't have the same powers, but they are representative and they can do things which are really important. Then I would say there's also outside of kind of New York, there's also what happens in Geneva, and Geneva is really important from a human rights perspective. But what we found important as well, so the Human Rights Council is in Geneva, and so the human rights kind of work, the bread and butter work of the UN happens in Geneva. But what we found very important and strategic is not to ensure that it doesn't get isolated to Geneva, because that's also a strategy of some states to keep it in Geneva and out of New York where things happen. So that's a strategy. But working with special procedures are really important because they have an authority. There's obviously also the human rights bodies in the treaty mechanisms, and there's cases that you can bring to those, which are really important. And the Human Rights Council itself. And we've seen, for example, recently in Sudan, they sent up a commission of inquiry, and we at Human Rights Watch were really at the forefront of pushing the UK and others to set up the commission of inquiry around that. We know there's a commission of inquiry on Israel-Palestine and many other issues as well. We also engage with the Universal Periodic Review, which again happens in Geneva, where each state is evaluated on the basis of their human rights record. So without going into all of them in too much detail, I would just say that strategically, we think about how do these multilateral fora operate? Where can we take advantage of them? Where should we be putting in our resources? And then we sort of mobilize around those. But I think all of them have potential value. But it's just thinking about how you do that, and also not expecting any of them to be able to change everything, or even, mostly, but to think of them as part of the toolkit of how you're bringing about change in a given situation. I hope that's slightly helpful. I know I haven't. There's just so much to go into, and I would say that also litigation, as you said, it's that kind of the court for the human rights in the UK. It's the apex court to a certain extent of human rights issues, and it's really, really important, as we're seeing, and potentially we've seen the Supreme Court decision, which means it won't necessarily go to Rwanda, but we know it was critical there on a whole host of issues. It's been critical, and obviously we've seen the attack on that institution currently happening in the UK. So, and we're obviously working very hard to push against that because of the protective role and the important role that the European Court and Convention plays in the UK.
Indeed, and of course it did have a significant role on Rwanda because of putting the injunctive kind of rules, or the stay on the removals in place right at the outset, which caused obviously a lot of consternation amongst people in government. And again, as you said, the debate continues around the appropriateness of that court being able to make decisions that affect national policy. Okay.
Jodie, I think you're on mute.
Yes.
Put myself on mute for some reason. Don't know why I did that. Yes, I'm going to move on to the next question then, and then we'll move on to some of the questions coming in from our audience. Ruth, let's come back to you because we haven't heard from you for a while. So question 5, in a constantly evolving global landscape, the priorities and challenges in the field of human rights can shift rapidly. Can you share examples of how you stay informed about emerging issues and adapt your daily work to address new developments? How do you balance long-term advocacy goals with the need to respond to immediate crises or opportunities? And obviously being sort of at the front line there, out of all of us, I think probably you have to be quite adaptive as well as keeping your knowledge as up to date as possible.
Yeah, I think specifically, well, I mean, many sectors of law, but immigration law, it feels like it just changes all the time. And an act comes in and then actually they're not doing that after all. They're going to do this instead. And then it's going that way. So you think you're getting your head around something and it changes all over again. But that feels like it's just part of the job. And it's another reason that it's never boring, because it's, you're not doing the same thing over and over because the law has changed. The situation has changed. So I read a lot. I read there's organisations like Free Movement that give updates. I read case law. I go to lots of trainings provided by barristers' chambers, which are very useful and often free, which is really good to attend. I talk to my colleagues, and then the way that I really learn to do things is where a client comes to see me with that issue, and that's when I really feel like I've got my head around it, when I've actually worked through a case dealing with those issues. Before that, it's always I've got a grasp, but I don't feel like it's rooted as well. So it's just, for me, it's just really a case of staying as up to date as I can. But I think with the work that I do, I'm always looking to see, is there a strategic issue that could come from this case? But at the same time, my duty is to the client that I am with that day and what their best interests are. So strategic work doesn't come as often with the work that I'm doing. It would every now and then, but my focus is on my individual clients, really.
Thank you. And yeah, where would any of us be without Free Movement, actually, in terms of keeping up to date? Adam, do you have any thoughts on this one?
It's being a barrister is not the best way to achieve strategic aims, unless your strategic aims are very wide, because ultimately you are I'm trying to think of a nicer way of putting it, but you are a tool for other people. If people instruct you to do something, and when you do it, you have to. It does. We also have something called the cab rank rule, which people will have heard of, which means that any client that comes to you that within the right sort of professional boundaries, you have to take, and that can mean acting for people that in terms of your own strategic aims as a sort of moral person that might not fit with those exactly. So you're better off thinking more about what how achieving justice in particular areas and particular cases than in wider policy goals. But sometimes, and as you get more senior, you can be more influential in that sort of area. And I'm privileged to be able to have some influence in some areas with certain fields which I've sort of tried to develop over the years, but through a mixture of non-legal work and legal work. So it's ultimately you need to do the best. As Ruth said, you have to do the best by your immediate clients, and that is the be all and end all of the job. Sometimes you can get into the wider campaigning stuff. It can be it can be a bit of a tension between those two things as well. Yeah, I mean, it's makes it never boring.
Right, and Yasmin, as a director, and I know this very well myself for being at Justice, the whole time you're having to kind of look at the landscape and think where are the priorities, where can we put our very sort of small resource into achieving change, and you have to kind of predict where the problems might arise as well. Do you have any insight into how you approach that in your world?
Yeah, that's one of the hardest. I think the hardest thing is to think about. There are so many issues, and I mean, particularly in the current environment domestically, there are just a plethora of human rights issues that you could work on, as well as obviously pushing on foreign policy. I think for me, we're at Human Rights Watch now, and even in my previous role at Rights and Security International, I'll always try and think about like what does Human Rights Watch, or previously Rights and Security International, bring to a particular issue, and therefore where might we be best served? And also I'm thinking about like what our mandate is, where our research is. So for example, it was a no-brainer for us to be working on Rwanda and be heavily involved in that, given that we've got so much work on Rwanda, we're researching it, so on and so forth. Similarly, on Israel-Palestine, it's a big part of the work that we do as an organization. So it makes sense that I would work not only on sort of pushing on the foreign policy side, but also be working on the anti-boycott bill. And that also intersects with the work that we're doing around due diligence laws and around ESG, and, you know, ensuring that public bodies are taking account of human rights in their investment and divestment. So it really intersects. So for me, it's thinking about, as an organization, what work are we doing, and what value can I bring? And then as HRW, we're an international human rights organization. Where can we help elevate certain voices or issues as well? And where will that be useful? I am constantly thinking about what issues are already well covered by NGOs and by organizations or lawyers or others in the UK. And so therefore, where am I probably not needed as much? And so really it's just looking at all of those different factors and thinking about how, I mean, really we're, as human rights activists, we're all here to serve. So how do we serve as best we can, thinking about our mandate, our resources, our capacity, where we add value. So really that's kind of the question that comes up for me quite a lot.
Yeah, totally. I'm constantly balancing those things. Okay. The next question is, and I think this is one that will be really important for everyone to kind of appreciate. We have got a session on this, so you don't need to go into any particular detail, but you know, we've touched on some really serious matters and issues over the course of the session, and self-care is really important. How do you manage the emotional toll of your workload? Have you got any particular strategies you've found helpful? Ruth, you're kind of dealing with some really, really serious issues with the client in front of you. What's your kind of method of managing that?
I think it's something I've built up over a long time. I've been doing it for about 10 years. And when I first started doing it, I found it really difficult. And it's just been sort of working out the best ways for me to cope. I think my top thing is being in a really good team and having colleagues. And at the end of a meeting, I can go and say, oh, I've just sat through, and to be able to talk about it, be able to say, this is what I've just seen, this is how I'm feeling about it. That's really helpful. Which has actually been harder since COVID, because we're not all in the office, we're not all seeing each other all the time. It's a bit harder to pick up the phone and have those chats, but you need a debrief. I need a debrief anyway. And then there's the kind of, you know, I do yoga, I go for runs, I go to the pub occasionally. I enjoy time with my family. You know, the kind of more standard side of things. There's also a really good organisation called Claiming Space who do or did do at least sort of group meetings for people who are doing this kind of work and who are struggling with vicarious trauma. So that's been very helpful. And just we also at Southwark Law Centre have monthly reflective practice sessions where we can talk about how we're doing. We have access to counselling if we need it. So I think it's partly having a good supportive organisation, and it's partly the practice of getting used to how you're managing it. But sometimes I feel like I'm on it and I'm coping, and other times I'll just leave an appointment and cry. So even 10 years down, I don't think I've completely smashed it. It's it's a work in progress.
Yeah, I mean, I think we wouldn't be human if things didn't affect us. You know, I was doing an inquest last week and it left me very emotional afterwards. It's impossible not to, I think, and it's just how you're able to kind of, as you say, use that reflective process as much as possible, and your networks, as Adam was saying about, you know, networks to assist with the work, but it's also really important to have those people to go to, isn't it? That you can talk things through with if you need to. I want to just move on to a final question, and I'm conscious that many of the questions people are asking us are about what advice you have for a career really in this area. We have got a session which is going to be looking at the core skills you need to develop a human rights practice. So I don't want to spend a huge amount of time on that, but if you could just be thinking if there's one suggestion you could give, each of you, to try and answer. There's people coming from all sorts of backgrounds here, from corporate side of things, from international environments all over the world, bringing all sorts of experience, but the common issue that everyone seems to be talking about is the difficulty, of course, of getting into kind of a human rights practice. And I think in the context of how we all started in the previous session of saying, you know, human rights law is everywhere, maybe you've got a tip that you could share, and everyone who is asking those questions, please do stay for the next session. Well, not the next session, it's going to be at 2:00, the session that I think will deal with this question in much more detail for you. But I want to just finally ask you our question 7, which is, what has human rights work personally meant to you over the course of your career so far? And is there a case that has particularly resonated for you? Which might be very hard, but do tell us if there's one that you'd like to share.
The last bit you just cut out in the last bit of the question.
Is there a particular case that you've worked on that has resonated for you personally? So if you can think of one, over such a long period of time, all of you, then please do share. Has anyone got one in mind? Who shall we go to first? Adam?
It's hard to choose because lots of cases have resonance for different reasons. Sometimes you become very attached to the client. Sometimes it's about an issue which affects you, personally. I think I find the ones that I find the most meaningful are often the ones that have a personal resonance to me, but they're also the hardest. And in fact, it kind of goes back to that question about how to manage this very stressful career. And one of the ways, I think one of the important things is to try and keep away from the issues which are really deeply personal for you, or at least don't do them all the time, because it can just be too hard. So you've got to try and keep a separation. But I mean, what I do anyway. I mean, I was very involved in issues around anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, which as a Jewish person was very personal to me, as also particularly as a Jewish person who's a Labour supporter and is on the left. That it really hit a lot of my personal buttons, and it was very difficult work, and it involves a lot of public advocacy, legal advocacy, working with the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and there was a lot of sort of it got me into personal difficulties. For example, having complaints made against me at the bar standards board, which were not upheld. But you don't want to be in that situation at all, and it feels very personal. So I think that piece of work over a couple of years was probably the one that really resonated with me personally, and I look back on as a sort of I can really it means a lot to me. But I've got I've been fortunate enough to be involved in cases which mean a lot to a lot of other people, and just in a way just as important. But from a sort of personal perspective, that probably was the one.
Yeah, thank you. And that's always, it's very difficult, isn't it? When, I mean, you ultimately have to do what you think is right. And I also have been on the receiving end of the BSB referral, which is not a pleasant experience. Yasmin.
Yeah, just coming in, I think for me, there's been I've had the privilege of working on lots of different cases in the kind of the broader sense. Some of the things, probably the ones that have stuck to me and with me the most, and that's hard to say because so many have, but is my work with refugees in Australia around mandatory detention. I worked in these mandatory detention centres when I was just in my final years of law school. And I still, and I think it's something that's now obviously with the Rwanda deal and everything that's happening in the UK, it's really obviously picked back up. And with the fact that the UK is now kind of adopting the same policies and rhetoric that Australia did. But I will never forget, there was a person who I had met in detention, and then I'd gone away and I'd gone and studied overseas and worked at the ICTY and done all of this stuff. And then I came back to do a few months of work back in the detention centres, and the same man was there, and we were in a room and the clock had stopped in the room. And I'll never forget the feeling of thinking, I've gone away after law school and I'd had these amazing opportunities to travel and learn and do all of this. And this person his life had stopped in detention merely, and he'd been locked up merely for seeking protection in Australia. And so some of those things will never leave me, the kind of inhumanity and sort of policies, but the individuals that affects. Just coming quickly to your question about the advice. I appreciate it's really hard to get into the human rights field. I would say think creatively of what that looks like. It doesn't always have to be working at HRW or Amnesty, or it can look like working in the pro bono section of a corporate firm. They have pro bono. It could look like I, for example, went and worked in government as a government legal advisor. I wanted to, hone my skills as a public international lawyer. It can look like working in a community law centre, which I would say actually is some of the most fundamental work, important work happens on the ground. It might not look like the sexiest work, but to me, it's some of the most important work. So think creatively about what does it mean to work in human rights. It's not always at a human rights organisation. It can be done through other really important ways. And think about your career as a journey. It doesn't have to be the first step. It can be blocks to getting you where you are. And also take opportunities to network, to do things in a pro bono capacity, to write articles, build up your muscle and your experience so that you come to any position that you want to apply for with all of that as well. So there's a couple of thoughts from my end.
Yeah, that's immensely helpful. Thank you. Adam's had to leave us. He's donned his wig and he's off into court to make those arguments he was telling us about. Ruth, a case for you, and then a tip as someone who is there in the community law centre on the front line doing that vital work that Yasmin's spoken about, if you could.
Sure. So when I was thinking about this case, it's so funny. My case is almost exactly the same as Yasmin's case. It was a person who I left behind in immigration detention. I wanted to come out and say it's the cases that you win, and they are the cases that you win are the best, and we're so lucky we win so many of our cases. But the ones that resonate are the ones where there's a person still behind in immigration detention. It's just awful. But anyway, to move on to more positive things, I think there are lots of different ways to get into this sector. And I highly recommend getting into this sector. I absolutely love my job. I hugely enjoy it. And I'd recommend it to anyone who's interested in law in a way that's going to make you feel proud and you know, and happy with what you do. So I would say start with, there's a brilliant organisation called Young Legal Aid Lawyers. It's a network. They have monthly meetings. I used to be on the committee. They also have a mentoring scheme. So one of the first things I did was get a mentor through Young Legal Aid Lawyers, and that was someone who was practicing law, and I could talk to them and say, how did you do this? Could you look at my CV? What do you think? And then I would say, look at small legal aid firms. Legal aid doesn't pay much money. These firms don't have big marketing departments. They're not recruiting 2 years in advance, but they're on your high street and they're doing brilliant things. So go see what's in your area, send them a speculative CV, ask if you can have a chat, and then it's connections. Do you know someone who knows someone who knows someone who works in a criminal law firm? Can you spend a week doing work experience? And when you get there, do a really good job. And it's such a small sector. If you show up and you're not very interested, it's not going to get very far with it. You need to really be committed to what you want to do, and then start at the bottom. Like I started doing admin. I was just doing admin in a refugee law clinic, and then I was doing a bit of casework, and then Justice First Fellowship is something I'd hugely recommend as well. Go and have a look at that. But be prepared to do the less glamorous work. If you not everyone can, but if you can afford it, volunteer alongside the studies that you're doing. Spend a day a week at Citizens Advice or a law centre, and show people that you're really interested, is what I'd say.
Yeah, all fantastic tips. Thank you. And I'm conscious, to those of you who are feeling the pressure of joining a corporate firm, I entirely understand the fees that you will have racked up from all your tuition to this point will feel immense, and maybe legal aid isn't an opportunity that's available for you at this point. As Yasmin said, all of the big commercial law firms have a corporate social responsibility output. They have a pro bono section. You can go and work with them. It isn't that's the end of the game for you just because you go and take up a traineeship at one of those firms. All of us, as I hope you've heard on this session, have had so many different experiences. Thank you so much, Yasmin. Off you go as well. We've come through different paths, and I started in a self-employed practice doing common law in a barrister's chambers. I then went into the NGO world, and now I'm back in chambers. So you can be creative and find all of the methods that are available to you, and as Ruth said, use all of those networks that you can build and ask the right questions. I just want to answer one final question, because and I know so many of you have asked about what sort of tips we might have. Please do stay on to listen to the rest of the day, because there's going to be answers to these questions for you in much more detail. I just want to answer this question that someone asked about, and you can't see it because it's on the Q&A. I'll press answer live, but I want to move on. Do we have any hope for the future of human rights, essentially, given the landscape? And it is very difficult, having spent 20 years practicing in this area. And when I started to practice, the Human Rights Act had just come in, and it looked like we were on the threshold of doing amazing, fantastic things, and the world would be brilliant. And it sort of feels like some of that is dismantling. I think what that should sort of demonstrate to any of us who are interested in this area, which, as we keep saying, is actually everything, it's the entire legal landscape, is we have to just keep going, and we have to keep taking these points and making these arguments on the basis that our clients need us to do it. And we just keep fighting, and sometimes it can be very hard, as you say, walking away from the immigration centre, Ruth, and feeling like you haven't been able to achieve anything. You have to just keep picking yourself up and keeping going, don't you? And that's all ultimately we can do, and keep working together, because this network, as you see today, BHRC and Human Rights Lawyers Association, we are all, amongst many other organisations, trying our best to promote and protect human rights. On that note, can I thank Ruth as the remaining speaker in our panel, because everyone has gone off to do important human rights work, so much for all of your thoughts, insights, advice and experiences. And I'm going to hand over now to Grania Mellon, who is the Vice Chair of our Human Rights Committee, as well as a fellow barrister at Garden Court Chambers, who is going to take on the next session for us, strengthening the rule of law and civil society through pro bono culture. Thanks, Grania.
Thanks very